Lindsay Paterson was born in Scotland in 1956. He studied mathematics and English literature at Aberdeen University before completing his PhD in statistics at Edinburgh University. His first faculty position took him to the Department of Actuarial Mathematics and Statistics at Heriot-Watt University to conduct epidemiological research. He later returned to the School of Social and Political Science at Edinburgh University, where he is Professor of Education Policy. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 2004 and a Fellow of the British Academy in 2013. Most of Paterson's research concerns educational policy, which also forms a central thread of this article, along with occupations that people pursue after finishing school. In this case, he takes a detour from his usual studies to consider differences between Protestants and Catholics in Scotland, though few of his other publications involve religious topics. While some research like that of Goldschmidt can view religious identity as a byproduct or result of social class differences in society, Paterson here reverses the lens so that we can see how religious identity might also contribute as one of the causes or determinants of social class position. The connection between religion and social class can operate in both directions. Once upon a time, the whole world was Catholic, or at least it seemed like the whole world if you happened to live in Europe. Pretty much all of Western Europe was Roman Catholic, while Eastern Europe was Orthodox Catholic, at least the part that hadn't been overrun by the Muslim Ottoman Empire. But then, just about the time that Europeans and little wooden ships started to discover that there was a lot of the rest of the world out there, about which they knew little or nothing, the Protestant Reformation burst out in place after place in the northwestern regions of Europe itself. In England, starting in the 1530s, King Henry VIII kicked out all the bishops and cardinals and took over all their churches, replacing the Pope with himself and creating the Church of England. Up north in Scotland, King James remained Catholic, and several Reformation agitators were executed by the Catholic rulers. The Scottish religious landscape became a contest between Catholic France and Protestant England, with the battle surging back and forth for decades. Eventually, John Knox got the support of some noble Scottish families that approved of the Reformation and preached his way into creating the Presbyterian Church. Instead of a pope or even King Henry, this denomination, invented in Scotland, vests authority in a presbyter or local council of elders and ministers, replacing the centralized hierarchy of a church with a kind of home rule for local congregations or regions. This went well with the powerful local family groups controlling different parts of the country. Although it took longer in Scotland, eventually the Protestants won the contest permanently, particularly when the Acts of Union united Scotland, England, Wales, and Northern Ireland into Great Britain in 1707. Knox's Presbyterian Church became the official state church of Scotland. Almost 2 centuries of cruel battles between Catholics and Protestants did not make the Presbyterians gentle winners either. Hard feelings on both sides meant that once the Protestants were solidly in control, the Catholics still in the country could look forward to hostility, prejudice, and systematic discrimination in nearly all walks of life, from schools and neighborhoods to the workplace and possible marriage partners. As the Protestants encouraged development of formal education and the new urban industrial economy, they left little or no room in it for the Catholics except at the bottom, doing the worst jobs and living in the worst parts of town. For more than a century after Scotland was absorbed into the United Kingdom, all that anti-Catholic discrimination didn't usually draw much attention or create much controversy because the Catholic minority was small and structurally isolated. The rapid industrialization of the 1800s, though, brought in a wave of Catholic laborers from Ireland to help building the railroads and work in factories. In fact, the Irish who fled the potato famine there in the middle of the 1800s were more likely to go to Scotland in the north than to England in the south. This industrial immigration reinforced the tendency of Catholics to become concentrated in cities like Glasgow on the country's western coast, to work in blue-collar laboring jobs, to live in neighborhoods strongly segregated by social class, and to experience chronic unemployment, low wages, poverty, poor health, and lack of access to public services, including schools. As generations of their children replaced these immigrants, they became part of the Scottish Catholic population. Rather than people of different social classes sorting themselves out into different religious denominations, in Scotland we find a case of the reverse direction of influence. If you are brought up by your parents in a particular religion, in this case Catholicism, that religious identity has a powerful impact on where you subsequently find yourself in the hierarchy of social classes in your society. Even though the social realities of everyday life in Scotland made Catholics into second-class citizens for many generations and relegated them to the lowest blue-collar levels of the occupational distribution, and even though the Presbyterian Church became the official state church of Scotland, the Catholic Church was not actually outlawed or suppressed. If you wanted to be a Catholic, you were free to do so, and then to face the consequences. So there are still Catholic parishes and priests in Glasgow and Edinburgh, and in fact the Catholic Church even has received support from the Church in other countries for its efforts to create Catholic schools where students could receive a good education. Also, as in other countries, these Catholic schools have achieved a reputation for providing a solid educational foundation for their students, giving them at least a chance to compete for better positions on the occupational ladder in Scotland. Here, as we find in so many parts of the world, education takes center stage in the efforts of people at the bottom of the social hierarchy to improve their lot. The Catholic Church was simply trying to add its support to this quest. As Paterson discovered in his research for this article, there seems to have been some recent success in the efforts of Scottish Catholics to break down the almost ascriptive link between being Catholic and ending up at the bottom of the economic barrel in Scotland. He has two questions about this apparent recent progress. First, is it real? Is it true that the social class position of Catholics in the country has been improving lately? And if it is true, can we understand how and why this happened? For example, was it a result of changes in the educational system, his main field of study? If so, this would be another piece of evidence that schooling acts as a conveyor belt carrying you into your adult social class assignment, and that in turn would mean that if we tinker around with the formal educational system, we can change that conveyor belt to get rid of perceived unfairness. We may not be able to get rid of inequality and social classes themselves, but we might be able at least to do something to make sure that where you end up in that respect is a result of your own efforts and achievements more than it is a result of some other kind of group characteristic that has been ascribed to you. This is just the sort of question and possible consequences of the answer that has motivated Paterson's career in educational research. So he dives into finding answers enthusiastically. Before we can begin to consider the evidence that Paterson put together, we need to take a moment to come to terms with the fact that the concept of social class is not measured or even thought about in identical ways in different countries. In fact, not even occupational distributions are defined or measured in the same way everywhere. There are still different versions of occupational groupings competing with one another for the prize of official recognition by governments and scholars as the best way to organize the matter. Paterson uses a set of occupational groupings put together by the English sociologist John Goldthorpe. These groups not only distinguish between layers or levels of jobs ranked by needed qualifications and by prestige and financial reward, as commonly examined in the United States, but also reflect the European emphasis on how different jobs are related to the productive organization of the economy. Most specifically, as shown here for data from the 2001 Scottish Household Survey, in one of Paterson's other articles, we find the familiar blue-collar manual labor jobs, colored blue of course, and the white-collar professional and managerial non-manual occupations, but also a fifth category of self-employed small business owners who work for themselves, not for either wages or salaries. As we can see, the 2001 labor force of Scotland was almost evenly divided between the blue-collar manual occupations on one side and everybody else, including the small business proprietors, on the other. When Paterson started this research right around the turn of the century, he decided to use the 1997 Scottish election survey, because that national survey asked not only about people's occupations and education, but also about their religious backgrounds. In fact, the survey asked two different religion questions. One about the religion, if any, in which you grew up as a child, living with your parents, and another question about your current religious affiliation in adulthood. Since Paterson is interested to see how life turns out later for people who start out in life already identified with a particular religion, he puts his main emphasis on the first question about your religion when you were growing up. To show how things have changed in Scotland, he also decides to look at two different generations of people. Those at ages 45 or older in 1997, which means the youngest of them were born in 1952, shortly after Paterson himself, and those old enough to have an occupation, that is age 18, up through age 44. This age dividing line gives us a dramatic contrast, as shown here by a figure derived from Table 2 in Paterson's article. In the older generation, born in the first half of the 20th century, Catholics are only half as likely as other Scottish workers to have jobs outside the blue-collar sector of skilled and unskilled manual laborers. Since 28% of Catholics have such non-manual jobs, that means that 72% of them are blue-collar manual laborers. Less than half of the other non-Catholics in the labor force have blue-collar manual occupations. However, this non-manual job deficit of Catholics completely disappears when we look at the younger generation of people under age 45. The share with non-manual occupations is over half of all workers and virtually identical for Catholics and non-Catholics. Paterson briefly considers the possibility that this might not represent actual social change, but might instead just be an age effect. Maybe today's young Catholics will show a similar occupational deficit in the second half of their working lives in another 20 or 30 years. But he finds this highly unlikely because few people move from non-manual to manual jobs as they get older. If anything, it's usually the reverse. So he accepts this generational contrast as an actual shift in society, and that means he has to look around for an explanation of it. We probably have no trouble agreeing with Paterson that the generational shift he found for Catholics represents progress. When statisticians work with the Goldthorpe occupational categories, they routinely give them Roman numeral numbers instead of names. The professions and managers are category number 1, and in the 5-category approach used here, the unskilled manual workers are category number 5. These numbers express the general consensus that occupational groups are not just different from one another, like species of birds, but are ranked in a clear hierarchy of social prestige, financial reward, and qualifications needed for each type of job. In other words, these occupational categories put people into social classes. If Catholics concentrate disproportionately in the lower blue-collar occupations, that means that religion from their childhoods is steering them into a distinct and disadvantageous class position. On the other hand, if there's no such disproportionate concentration, maybe the link between religion and class has been broken, and Catholics are mixing and competing with everybody else in the economic scramble for the best careers. Since Paterson specializes in educational statistics, he was attracted to this research in the first place because one possible influence that could break that link between religion and class might be education. After all, in Scotland, just as in the United States or almost anywhere else, your educational attainment is a very strong predictor of your eventual occupation, and so your social class. The correlation is not perfect, of course, because education is not the whole story for jobs and careers. But the chart shown here from Paterson's other 2005 article nicely illustrates that well over half of the people in occupation group number 1 for professionals and managers have been to university in Scotland, though not all of them have graduated, while over 2/3 of the unskilled laborers have only managed to complete one of the 2 lower educational levels. If Catholics in the younger generation got a lot more education than the earlier generation, that might explain at least part of their better career outcomes. Paterson finds this to be a realistic guess because just about the time that this younger generation came along, Scotland made some fundamental changes in educational policy. They switched from what they call selective to comprehensive standards for admission to advanced secondary schools and universities. Since Catholic students were coming from relatively disadvantaged family backgrounds, Paterson thinks that this policy change may have opened a lot of doors for them, and as a result, more Catholics might have started going further in school. But he admits from the start that there could be another side to this story. During the same decades of the late 20th century, the occupational distribution itself shifted dramatically in Scotland, so that all these people finishing school and looking for jobs were aiming at a moving target. The long-standing economic foundation of shipbuilding and heavy industry collapsed in Scotland in these decades, and along with it, a lot of local Scottish employers disappeared. In their place, a lot of outside companies from England, Europe, and even the United States and beyond began to penetrate into the Scottish economy, so that Scottish workers faced a whole new spectrum of employers. Paterson's guess is that these outside employers might have been less prejudiced against Catholics, and that at least part of their occupational progress might have had nothing to do with their educations, but rather with the replacement of old employers with new ones. The relative importance of these two possible explanations forms the basic question that he has to sort out by analyzing the evidence that he has chosen. Did Catholics in Scotland make educational progress from one generation to the next? If so, perhaps Paterson can link that progress to their progress in shifting from blue-collar jobs to non-manual occupations. We must remember, though, as he cautions us, that education has been increasing for everybody, not just for Catholics. The late 20th century brought decade after decade of dramatic increases in higher education, so we can't just look at education of Catholics by themselves. When Paterson sets up his statistical model, he estimates the significance of what we call an interaction effect between generation, religion, and education. That is, do educational gains from one generation to the next happen differently for people from different religious origins? It is not enough for Catholics to make some progress. They have to shift further than the non-Catholics in order to make progress on this playing field where the goalposts themselves have been moving. Fortunately for his explanatory story, that is exactly what we find. Among the older generation born in the first half of the 20th century, shown here as the top two bars in the chart based on Paterson's Table 7, Scottish Catholics lagged seriously behind non-Catholics. They were more concentrated in the lowest education group, shown in red, and lagged behind the highest group, shown in green. The occupational lag we have already seen for Catholics in this older generation may reflect this educational lag. As you remember, that occupation lag totally disappeared among the younger generation of Catholics. So if education is the explanation, then the education deficit also should disappear here in the lower two bars in the chart. This does happen to some extent. The share of Catholics in the very lowest education category is as low or even lower than for the non-Catholics. But the educational lag does not disappear completely. Catholics are still more concentrated in the second lowest group and slightly behind in the top two. This is why, when he estimates his full statistical model, Paterson concludes that educational gains for Catholics do indeed account for some of the erasing of the occupational gap, but not for all of it. Some of that gap still remains to be explained by other factors outside of the schools. The other thing that seems to have happened for Catholics in Scotland is that what economists call returns to schooling have improved more for them than for non-Catholics. This means that within any given category of education, such as graduating from university, for example, Catholics are actually getting better jobs in the younger generation than older Catholics were able to get with the same education. The education credentials pay off more for Catholics than they did in the past. And in fact, these returns to schooling also increased faster for Catholics than for non-Catholics. What could be going on here? This is precisely where his earlier discussion of prejudice and discrimination come into the picture. Such discrimination against Catholics is a classic cause of low returns to all forms of human capital, including education. So what if you went to university? You're still a Catholic, and I'm still not going to hire you. If religious discrimination became less common, returns to schooling should naturally improve faster for Catholics, as they are evaluated on a more meritocratic basis, to use Paterson's phrase. He gives some very interesting evidence that this might have happened, too. Concentrating for a moment on only those people, both Catholic and non-Catholic, who did get non-manual jobs, he explores how many of those non-manual jobs were in the private sector and how many were in the public sector of government employment. Among the few Catholics with non-manual jobs in the older generation, even fewer worked for the government. This is not because there were no government jobs back then either. After all, nearly half of all the older non-Catholics in the Scottish survey who worked in these white-collar jobs were also, in fact, in the public sector. So in the bad old days, obviously discrimination against Catholics also extended to the government, not just to private firms. As education increased, especially for Catholics, and as the occupational mix in Scotland as a whole shifted away from industrial blue-collar jobs to the service sector, not only did the share of Catholics with non-manual jobs double for the younger generation, as we already have seen, but within this category, the share working for the government also doubled. Most of the new non-manual jobs for Catholics were in the public sector. This should surprise nobody, because when any society begins to make a conscious effort to dismantle discrimination against any disadvantaged minority, whether defined by religion or some other feature of their lives, progress is almost always fastest in the public sector, where all the rules for job selection are out in the open, and it is harder to hold on to old prejudices and use them to discriminate actively against people. The same public sector expansion in the United States also has benefited disadvantaged minorities of every type in the same way and for the same reasons. This is one reason why all those who hold on to the old prejudices are always eager to call for smaller government in order to take away that source of meritocratic selection into jobs. To put the Scottish case in perspective, Paterson also presents some very interesting parallels from the same sort of survey data for England to the south. This chart, taken from his Table 5 and 6, shows the equivalent percentages of workers in non-manual jobs in England, this time not only for Protestants and Catholics, but also bringing in Hindus, Muslims, and even people who declared on the survey that they were not brought up in any religion. In general, we see again that compared to the older generation from the early 20th century, the younger generation from the late 20th century shows a shift toward more white-collar employment as the blue-collar sector shrank away in England, just as it did in Scotland and elsewhere. The only exception is the people not raised in any religion. They actually became more concentrated in the youngest generation in blue-collar jobs. Paterson says very little about this odd result. But the situation observed in Scotland for Catholics, that is, very large shifts from manual to non-manual jobs between generations, appears here instead for non-Christians, especially Hindus. This probably reflects changing immigration patterns from India and the Middle East, rather than any kind of educational effects going on within England itself. But the second thing to notice is that even in the older generation, both Protestants and Catholics were far less involved in blue-collar jobs in England than in Scotland, especially older Catholics. Earlier modernization of England's economy, the shift away from industrial jobs and the growth of the service sector, and improvements in English education apparently did away with occupational class differences for Catholics, even for the older generation. At least if we only consider the manual-non-manual distinction, this is the result we see. Paterson considers a couple of other alternative ways to slice the occupational cake and always comes up with the same result. The moral of this story seems pretty clear. Like any other aspect of ethnicity, people can be prejudged and discriminated against on the basis of the religion in which they've been brought up. Systematic treatment of this sort can produce an alignment, an overlap between ethnicity and social class, and such alignments can make it doubly hard to do anything about the problem of persistent inequality that is based not on your personal attitudes or abilities, but is rather ascribed to you on the basis of simply belonging to such a group. But as Paterson shows us, apparently it also is possible through the application of well-considered and well-executed, deliberate public policies to tackle such discriminatory problems and to make progress in giving all people a chance to show what they as individuals are capable of achieving.